I don't think there's too much debate over the fact that XR is quite white. And there are some communities that are not being engaged by XR's story. So we want to kind of talk about that and talk about how we can change the conversation. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to ask both playwrights, for the benefit of people who might not have been in the previous session, to talk about your play. What was it about? What was the message you were trying to get across, and why that particular angle? Urielle, would you like to start?
Okay. I wrote Rituals, which basically the idea came from the fact that I don't really know much about the environment, and that as much as I want to protect it, don't really feel like it's mine, or I have the power really to run that conversation that needs to be had in saving it. So I guess in some ways, Rituals was more about what has come forth to me in terms of like what you're meant to do or how you're supposed to treat the environment, and the people, the characters behind it, the characters that come with that message, and how weirdly strange they can be and otherworldly they can be, hence our witchy woo voodoo priestess kind of character, because anytime someone talks to me about the environment, it feels like the film Get Out, because so I can't really escape you. It's like, I know what you're saying is true, but do I exist in the face of this revolution you're trying to create, or am I just, I don't know, funding more of your weirdness? I don't know. Yeah, I guess so. I don't know if there's anything else I can... Well, I just wrote from that perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a really interesting and valid perspective as well for us to see, because sometimes in the climate movement you can get so wrapped up in the movement and in all the meetings that you go to, and you don't really have the opportunity to see how we look like from the outside to people who aren't engaged. And so seeing your perspective on that, and yeah, we sometimes are a bit weird, and it was really interesting to see to see us. We often get called cultish, and we can get a bit defensive about that, because we are within our own little bubble, and we see that what we're trying to do is really important. But it is equally valid to get that outside perspective and kind of work out, how people see us and what we can do to engage people who see us that way. Like, how can we tell people that we're not weirdos who, empty our menstrual cups into rose bushes and all of that.
I mean, because I was even thinking when I was doing research, like, into certain things, I was like, wow, I'm from Cameroon, and in Cameroon, in the north of Cameroon, there's like serious like drought problems. Like, there's whole villages moving further into the central parts of Cameroon because there's no water, and even just thinking about the fact that, like, I'm a second generation immigrant in this country, and my family moved here, for better life, better conditions to live in, and better opportunities. And that alone just, it just is insane, because when I think if my grandmother hadn't made the sacrifices she made for us to be here, like, I would be living that life. And I just think when we talk about the environment, we don't really take into consideration the people who are face front with the problems, like with the real like issues. Because I don't think it's an issue here, but people aren't dying from that here. People aren't losing their homes as often as they are over there, and especially within the kind of battle between the Francophone Cameroonians and the English-speaking side of Cameroon, it's even more intense, like, the situation over there. I mean, a part of me did think I should just write about that. But I was like, how am I going to talk on something that I'm not really experiencing, because I've had the privilege of being here? So yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. You clearly do have a really deep understanding of climate change and climate justice.
Thank you.
Thank you for that insight. Joe, do you want to talk about your play?
Sure. So hi, I'm Joe. I wrote the short called We Need to Go Far Quickly. And it's about, if you didn't see it, it's about an activist and an engineer sort of on their way out of the door to go to an XR meeting, and sort of one of them wants to go, one of them doesn't. And I wrote it because my day job used to be for a renewable energy organisation, a non-profit. And so I worked there for 5 years, and I still do some work with them, kind of speaker training and that sort of stuff. And just while I was there, learned a lot from the people that that were running it and that were working there. And that particular organisation works with all sorts of, all sorts of companies within that industry. So everyone from lawyers to engineers to developers to it's kind of like the whole. We've got an overview of the whole industry. And when I was working there, when I started, it was like the beginning of the coalition. So everything was being cut, including renewable subsidies, and so the whole thing was changing, and lots of jobs were being lost, even though it was an industry that was creating jobs and required very little subsidy and created a lot of jobs, a lot of opportunity, did a lot of good with very little public money that it had. So it was quite an education for me, and an interesting microcosm of what was happening just in society at that time. And I guess I wrote this short because the last time I did some work with that company, Regen, there was Extinction Rebellion, happened in the time that I'd not been working there, and it came up as a conversation. And I think I was sort of told from their perspective that there was this sense on one hand that there was this huge, I guess, relief and thank goodness, the rest of the world is catching up and getting on board with this. But on the other hand, a bit of where were you 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, and a bit of resistance from almost well, we have been doing this, we've already been making these changes and driving this, and now suddenly a group of people who aren't experts in it are sort of trying to steer the conversation in a specific way. So there's a bit of tension there, and I was really interested in that. And tried to distill that into two characters who disagree but ultimately need each other, because I think that is the case, is that we're all coming at this from very different perspectives. And I guess bringing it back to this question is that we just need everyone. We need everyone on board, and we need to leave no one out and no one feeling disengaged, because it's not going to happen otherwise. We're not going to solve it. Yeah, that's why I wrote it.
Thank you. So I think I know the answer to this, but when did you engage with the climate crisis? What was the moment for you? Was there a particular story? Was there something that you remember that switched you on?
Yeah, it was a lesson. We had a supply teacher come in when I was in year 4, and just did this whole day with us on the environment. It wasn't climate change, actually. At that point, it was things like pollution and deforestation, and I guess partly because that was, in the 90s, it was more about the ozone layer and forests burning down and that kind of stuff. Climate change obviously was known, but it wasn't talked about in the same way that it was sort of 10, 20 years after that. So yeah, it was that lesson in combination with films like Free Willy and David Attenborough programs and all that kind of stuff. And I was just always interested in the natural world. And yeah, I was a card-carrying member of the Young Ornithologists Club because I'm that cool. And yeah. So yeah, it was quite young that I engaged.
And at what point did you engage with Extinction Rebellion? Because I know you have been to Extinction Rebellion meetings.
Yeah, I came in costume. I have a T-shirt which I made, but it's too cold to just wear that. So, yeah, it was you, Beck, actually. That so the three of us were on the same writers program, coincidentally, a couple of years ago, and then I hadn't seen you in a while, and we were at the same event, and Extinction Rebellion just happened. And it was, yeah. I'm not just saying this, but it was. When I first heard about it, I was a bit I'm not sure if this movement. It's very militant, and it could turn a lot of people off of this cause. It could create this image of it could push a lot of people away when we need it to kind of become mainstream. And I said that to you, and Beck's response was kind of quite patiently, yeah, but we've got 12 years left, or we're literally going to die. And
Did I bully you?
no, it was, well, in a very polite and friendly way. But
Sounds like you, to be honest.
Yeah, and I guess I just thought, yeah, do you know what, Beck's right, and then went to. It took a little while, but then I went to a meeting and was quite involved in the stuff in October last year, and I guess that urgency, which it has captured as a movement, it has captured that urgency of we've got this really, rapidly closing window of time to sort this out, and I just really felt that and got involved.
Cool. Urielle, when did you engage with the climate crisis? Like, what was the moment for you?
I don't think I really, really, really engaged. But I would say, there was a time where I was like, everyone was being vegan around me. I was like, why are you being vegan? What is it? Like, why are we giving this stuff up? Like, why? And then I watched, a few videos and films about why we should be vegan and all this stuff. And it made me actually feel a bit more defeated about it. But it made me care, actually. But it also showed me that actually maybe this is also quite economical, that our issue in terms of at the end of the day, we would probably benefit from, let's say, the meat industries not getting as much money as they do, or the dairy industry. But then that's whole industries, and that's someone's bread and butter. And there are people who, as much as they care about the environment, want to protect their own bread and butter, And I guess in some ways, I think the whole vegan thing came because I wanted to eat better. And I had a friend who was eating. Yes, I'm looking at you, Maria. Yes, you. She was at drama school, always eating these really weird snacks and stuff. And it kind of got me into that, eating healthier and caring more about the environment. And I'd never really been into a vintage store before, and I was always into buying things brand new. And I was like, no, actually, I kind of like this way of living. So things started to change and adapt. So I wouldn't say there was a distinct moment, but I think there were small things that made me realize if I'm gonna talk about these things in my work, or if I'm gonna if I want to draw out a more positive message, I have to kind of change my own lifestyle, my own way of doing things. I'm not a vegan, by the way. I call myself the part-time vegan. Monday to Friday, I'm vegan, and then weekends, I just stuff my face with chicken. But I mean, but I just, I try. You know what I mean? I'm trying, guys.
I used to do that as well.
Yeah. So it's just happened gradually from the amazing creative influences I've had around me and friends, because I've just started to care a bit more, and about the future, genuinely, I care about the world we are handing over to our future generation, and if we're not giving them much if we're not giving them much left, then what are we doing? What's our purpose here? Why are we creating more chaos? I think there's so much of that I guess is fueling me.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because you talk about, that there are stories that you know of, about climate change. We all do, but then there's that extra trigger, isn't there, that often comes from your circle of friends. So, for example, with you, it was Maria and her veganism that made you think about veganism, or Joe, it was me. No, but you already very much had an understanding. You'd been working in those industries, but then having another person from your circle telling you that story from a personal place, it kind of activates something different in you, right? Is that's kind of what I was getting from?
Yeah, definitely.
So would you say that a good way of getting the story across is, as well as having the big kind of media messaging, the big kind of stories that we have, it's also talking to people that we know, that we have an influence on, and just talking to them as human beings about why it's important to be engaged?
Yeah. I think it's definitely also embedding the fact that we need to protect the environment for the people we care about. Honestly, people people matter, but the environment matters too. Like, we need the environment to be in a good space for there to be people. Like, it's like yin and yang, you know. And I guess that's why I would say, yeah, people are definitely have been my influence because I don't know. And also in what we do as artists, like we explore humanity and all the emotions and our stories and what makes us who we are. And the environment is greatly part of what makes us who we are. Growing up in a concrete jungle like called London, in Northwest London is kind of like I never really felt attached to the environment. But I remember like school trips and going to places where there's bare green and sheeps and stuff and being like, what's this? Like, this is lit. And like, even though like I felt detached from it, I cared about it because it was like, wow, like these lands that we drive past on the train, like someone's making my food, you know, like someone's making, this needs to be protected. This is sacred. So I guess that's also partly why it took me a while to get to this point of caring, because I've only ever lived in the concrete jungle. I don't see the trees, I don't see the birds, I don't see the animals that need protecting, or I don't see that, because I'm also thinking from the black female working class perspective, which is trying to survive, trying to be seen, and trying to hustle through. So I'm not really thinking about those things on the daily, but now I'm trying to make more of a conscious effort to think about those things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really important for XR to understand that as well, that not everyone is in that privileged position to be able to have the climate as their number one priority. Yeah. So what you're saying about people, about the planet being for people, takes me on to my next question about family. My family live in Malaysia. It's very hot. It's very close to the equator. It's always been very hot, but it is getting hotter. And we have this annual haze, which is when smoke from forest fires in Indonesia blows over all of Southeast Asia and engulfs Southeast Asia for like a couple of months a year. It's really bad. The air pollution's terrible, and we live with it every year, and we're just so used to it. It's really weird we don't make that connection between the haze, which is something that we breathe in, and the climate. We're not making the link between air pollution and the fact that air pollution is caused by forest fires on palm plantations. And that's anthropogenic climate change. My family, they don't think about that. I'm the only person in my family who seems to bang on about the climate crisis. So I can't really talk to them about it because they just don't really get it. I'd love to hear from each of you. Let's start with Joe, actually. How engaged are your family? And can you give some examples of that?
My mum bloody loves recycling. She really loves it. There's kind of like just Superwoman with the organisation of all the different things that need to be washed and the different bins, and and I've always been quite impressed with that, because that was the case even before we had the kind of infrastructure in. I'm from Devon, and I remember like as a kid this big campaign to kind of don't let Devon go to waste was the slogan, and there was all these stats about how much we throw away, and just kind of looking back on that now, thinking that not everyone was like my mum, that not everyone was going to like drive to a recycling point and take stuff and like wash it all up and everything. Like without that infrastructure, without the kind of council giving you the right bins and that sort of stuff, and having the facilities to do it. That's like a kind of micro thing in my own family that I always think of as an example. And so I'd say my mum's a definite self-described eco warrior with an O and an A, and then my dad, it's like, so my dad sells cars, so I think feels quite conflicted about this, because it's like, he's in an industry that, is very much part of this, and also we live in the southwest where, trains aren't brilliant and public transport's, trains aren't brilliant, buses are even worse, and you have to have a car pretty much wherever you live in the southwest, which is the case in lots of more rural areas. But he is like very excited about electric vehicles and that kind of stuff, and so I'd say they're pretty engaged. That doesn't feel like a very profound answer to that question, but that's my parents.
No, it's great. Your parents are brilliant. Mum, Dad, listen. Urielle, how about you?
I think we have this same mum because my mum loves to recycle too. I think the family loves to recycle in general. I don't know. And I definitely have one of those like family members who's always like fishing through other people's bins to make sure we're actually recycling. But I think that's partially because they're afraid of like being fined as well. You know what I mean? Ain't nobody wanting to spend no more money, giving more money to no government for nothing else. Okay, you lot are killing our pockets as it is. But also like I think in some ways, I don't know if you would say this as a contribution to the environment, but my grandma, her cousin, my grandma's cousin, owns an orphanage in Cameroon, and a lot of the time, the kids whose like parents who've died, especially with like malaria and with all this like no water in like north, like a lot of them come flog in from the north. They live in the orphanage there. So my grandma kind of like she pays for their new mattresses in the orphanage, and anytime the family go to Cameroon, we help out occasionally. So I guess in some ways that's the small contributions we make, but yeah, I mean that's as far as I think it goes. I mean, I make the conscious effort to make sure everyone turns off the plugs in my house. Does that count? I don't know. Yeah, that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like your grandma and your family in Cameroon, they're experiencing the climate crisis firsthand.
Yeah.
Is there an awareness that is what it is, that it's because of the climate?
I think there is an awareness. There isn't much awareness that it actually is that, because I think with all our government in Cameroon we've had the same president since the 80s. Everyone's like, when you gonna die? Like, dude, you ain't doing shit, man. Like, get off. But he's been there and really done nothing amazing for people. So I think there is more. There are more things to do. Everyone basically feels like, how is it that we have actually so much wealth in land, in other aspects, you know, oil, and yet our people are suffering so much. I think that's where the focus is. I think the focus is more in the fact that we talk about like most African countries talk about their independence, like woo 50 years independence, but it really feels like a lot of African leaders have Stockholm syndrome because we still out here feeding Western pockets. Like the Western world is like God or like Jehovah or something. And I think that's where most of the focus is. Everyone's too busy like pointing fingers at each other to see that actually we need to protect this, because it's not just you, but it's how we're treating the earth as well. I mean, the first time I went to Cameroon, I have this real thick image of like being this kid, like in the back of this car, and there was just this huge landfill of trash and like this toxic smell. Like as you got out of the cab, I was like, wow, like, is everyone just throwing their trash here? Is this where, I was thinking to myself at one point, is this where some of like Western trash is? Like, because this doesn't feel like, you know, this is all happening just here. But it was crazy. I'm like, and there's kids like living in and amongst that mess, that heap, walking around barefoot as well. Like, that's crazy. So I don't know, I've now lost my point. Sorry, guys.
No, I think you're onto something with all that rubbish,
yeah.
Because we do send all our rubbish elsewhere. I mean, we send like container ships full of rubbish all around the world. You know, Malaysia recently sent some back to the UK. They were like, you can have your rubbish back, thanks. And I was very proud of my country for doing that. But yeah, I think we've gone off on a tangent. But yeah. Absolutely. Like, when you see it firsthand, when you go to parts of the global south that are like the rubbish tip of the West.
Yeah. And it's kind of mad because you're like, your living conditions aren't even that particularly great because your government's not helping you in the ways it should. And then you now live amongst the trash that isn't yours as well, which is, it's kind of like, wow, I don't know. It's insane. And I definitely, when I think back to, I'm so grateful to be here, but I'm also really sad to see that actually, as much as we try to go back and help, there's only so much we can do because we aren't the colonial powers of the world, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe all we can do is try and hold them
accountable. Yeah, I think that's part of the key. I think it's letting them know that their version of humanity is not the only existing humanity. Like that there are people all around the world suffering. That your bread and butter isn't just a priority; it's other people's bread and butter. That's a priority too, and we will kind of need to make them sacrifices for each other. But that's the problem, like getting to the humanity, getting to people's conscience, and getting them to realize that you're meant to we're meant to help each other out, I guess. Yeah.
I just jump in on a point on that because I think there is a missed opportunity here with like a lot of the way we've talked about energy for the last few decades really has been about sort of trying to help developing countries catch up. But what that model has been a lot of the time has been like, cool, so you have very little energy infrastructure, for instance, and so then we'll build some power plants, fossil fuel power plants, and then and it's almost like trying to impose the same pattern. And actually, what's quite exciting with renewable energy is that you can just leapfrog that thing in the middle, that fossil fuel bit. You just can skip. You can just go straight to, and actually it suits a lot of more remote places where you can't have like a centralized grid and then just like export energy out, which is a very inefficient way of distributing energy. We lose about 2/3 of the energy that we send from like power plant down to home. Like it just gets lost along the way. And actually, like this model of kind of localized, decentralized power is a lot better in lots of ways. So and that's not just the same with energy. Like these better models for agriculture and all these things that are going to save us, rewilding and all this stuff that we all need to do. It can, there are better models basically. And I think just sort of that occurred to me as you were sort of saying about how the West, I guess, imposing a certain way of living needn't be the case. We can use these better models sort of straight away.
So I'm going to move on to the next question about story. So the story that XR has been telling up till now has been one of ringing the alarm bells, using the kind of the end is nigh, our house is on fire kind of narratives. It's a story of fear and of impending doom, and it has been very effective. It has mobilized a lot of people to join in a very, very short time. But there are still a lot of people who aren't dropping everything to join XR on the streets. Why do you think that scare tactic isn't working on everyone, and is there a better story that we could be telling, Joe?
I think we need all the stories that we can. In the same way that embracing diversity in the workplace leads to better companies and embracing it in the arts leads to better stories. I think, with this movement, kind of involving and including everybody is just going to make the whole thing better. And in terms of the ways people engage, like that is different for everyone. So I feel that's all the more evidence of that. Why we need to kind of just every kind of story. Like alarm will work, fear will work for some people in the way that optimism will work much better for other people. An academic way of thinking will be attractive to someone like me because I just like like reading essays and stuff, but and like long form articles. But that's just going to in the way that's going to like switch on and light for me, it's going to switch someone else off, and we're just different. Like everyone's different. So I was really struck in the last election here. Like there was a video of a mother in a community centre sort of like really shouting at Boris Johnson, kind of saying there were young children with like no shoes on their feet coming into this centre. Like, what are you going to do about that? And that as an image really stuck out to me, and kind of clearly to lots of other people, because that clip went viral, and it's to me that's like a microcosm of that, of the kind of stories that are like they're going to engage different people in different ways. That's a tangible thing. Like a child with no shoes on their feet because their home's been flooded and they've had to like run is just when we talk about displacement, it's not, that's very close to home, isn't it? You know, that's like, so I think, you know, the stories need to be like that, you know, like what's happening now, not just a kind of intangible, what's the scary future in 10, 20, 30 years going to look like, because that's actually very difficult to imagine, you know, and some of us love kind of a dystopian story, but lots of us don't. And yeah, it needs to land, it needs to connect, it needs to be real to people. Yeah. So
stories about the here and the now and the way the climate crisis is affecting us here now, not in 2050, this magical date. That
I don't mean that one's better than the other, but just that we need all of them. And in the same way, you know, like a kind of the majority of stories about this are scary and you know, bad news. And I think actually it's like on the occasion where there's a good news story that pops up, it is nice to like read something, you know, read about an example of rewilding that's really worked and how much carbon that's like retained in the, you know, like that's we need those stories as well, because we do need hope as well as fear.
Urielle?
I was going to say it's the same kind of similar thing. Like, I think what's important is inclusivity and accessibility. I think, you know, when you're, I mean, growing up in Northwest, like the environment was never a thing. Do you know what I mean? Like no one was talking about it like that. It wasn't, but then also like we don't have time to think about that because we have so much more like going on in terms of being able to put food on the table, making sure, you know, we're able to see tomorrow. And I think there's so much about that feels like if we don't see ourselves in the stories, then like you can try and scare us, but we're already scared by so much other shit that it's like, it doesn't feel scary enough. I'm not scared because I'm dealing with scarier stuff. I mean, that tactic works on probably, I don't know, Molly, who lives in Chelsea in her, you know, amazing penthouse apartment. But that's not scaring, you know, I don't know, Chioma, who lives on the block, you know, because she's constantly having to deal with the man them shooting each other on the streets and the fact that, you know, I'm on free school meals because mum can't, because they're not paying enough for this and she's only got, you know what I mean? Like, and there's like a few of us siblings in the house. There's no one's thinking about the environment in that situation. And I think that's part of the problem. I think, you know, the environment, when we talk about the environment and especially in stories, it feels urgent to a certain group of people because they ain't facing the things that people from another group are. Do you know what I mean? Like, it really scares, I feel like I'm trying to be politically correct, but it does. It scares the upper middle class, you know, white people because it don't, yeah, I mean, because that's probably the scariest shit going on in your life. I mean, language. So I think that's part of the problem, story-wise, because, you know, scaring only works for certain kinds of people. So maybe how about, like, grounding it in the reality of others and making it personal, because it is personal. I don't think people really see the environment as personal. And I think that's why I was talking about even with rituals like, you know, I want to fight for this earth. I do want a safer environment, but I don't own it. The system's built in a way to make me feel like I don't deserve to own it, that I don't even belong here. So if you're already trying to tell me to get away and I'm trying to figure out where home is, how are you trying to tell me to protect your home whilst you're telling me you don't think it's my home? I don't understand that. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that honesty. I think people need to hear that. So if scare tactics aren't getting through to people who have other things on their minds, but we also know that the climate crisis is going to affect those people the hardest. How can we? Is there another story that we can tell? How do we ground it in that reality for them?
I think it's about getting to know the people and understanding that, you know, it's also about providing opportunity. Because let's be real, like, not many working class people come to a theatre or see or want to go march because they need to go make money the way they can make money. But I think most of us seek our artistic inspirations, you know, on platforms that are accessible, like YouTube, the internet, you know. And I know those are, like, in some ways counterproductive because we are also draining the world, the earth of its resources. The more we click and the more we tweet and the more we watch and the more we whatever. But, like, also those are the most accessible. I always talk about how my intro into theatre took me a very long time because I never really thought theatre was a place for me. But my first intro into anything media or anything creative like that was TV and like the internet, you know. Watching EastEnders was my bit of theatre, my drama. Do you know what I mean? And I think it's accessing them in their environments, stepping into their fields, going into their community centres, going into their schools, giving the young kids activities to do that they can to contribute to the environment themselves, like, and then also not trying to make them pay for it whilst doing that. Maybe providing the snacks for the evening and Oyster card money too. Just saying.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Those are really good suggestions, actually, because you know what you say about not wanting to be part of a system where, you know, YouTube is getting clicks for, you know, companies that might be fueling fossil fuel. But we are still working within the system that we've got. And if that's how we access the people that need to hear the stories, then that's what we have to use. We're not in a place yet where we can completely overthrow our system. So if we have to work with what we got to get those stories out, then I think that's a really great suggestion. Like web series, like TikTok, all of that stuff.
Exactly. I mean, everyone's on this like Snapchat business. Like, use it in the way that they... the kids, the young generation use it. I mean, I'm not a Snapchat person, but I know that people do use that. But, like, there are ways to make it more accessible. But also I was going to say, like, I think, you know, with movements like this, you know, there are little costs to standing for a movement like that. And also acknowledging that, you know, you're willing to help cover those costs because this fight is bigger. Do you know what I mean? Like... I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've done, like, even just separately to, like, maybe arts stuff in general, and been like, shit, I have no money for my Oyster card, or I don't know, like, because I'm always worried about, there's so much more going on at home. There ain't no money on the Oyster card. I just have to plan things around. And I think there's so many young people who are in that situation who are like, I do want to stand, and I want to come to this rally, and I want to be able to do this, and I want to be, but it's not accessible for me. And I think it's definitely accessibility, because once it's accessible, then you're going to make me care. Like, I can care because you've come to my arena, yeah, to make me care.
Thank you.
Nice.
So I was going to read a poem in the previous session, but we didn't have time. It was a poem that was contributed by a playwright called Daniel York-Low. It was called Billionaire Village, and it was about the 39 Vietnamese migrants who died in the back of that lorry in Essex in December last year, the Essex 39. And it really showed where migrant justice issues and climate crisis intersect. And that's a story we don't often hear. Are there any other stories you think that are missing from the climate change narrative at the moment? I'm sorry, that's a really big... If you
I don't know, but I'm sure there are loads. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm just repeating myself here, but that's why I think we need all the kinds of stories we can get, and every platform, like you were saying, Urielle, because it's, I think agency is so important as well, like ownership of a story. That's why I've been so inspired by, kids at school, like just marching out of lessons, doing Friday for Futures, and self-organizing in that way, and like leading in a way that I think our generation kind of couldn't have imagined doing at that age in that time, and but that's that's also no accident, right? Like the those kids have used the tools that they do have available, the knowledge that they do have, the media that they do have access to, the tech that they have access to, sort of combined with the urgency of this crisis, now, and imagining their own futures. Kind of 12 years for them is like the early 20s, or late 20s, and so it's amazing, but it's also in some ways not surprising. What's really illustrative about that is the agency they clearly feel, and the ownership of, like, we're going to lead on this. Like, this is what we can do with our voices.
I think in my local schools, we don't have that drive, that togetherness and community about the stuff that's going on in the world. I think, in general, when you go to school, you're taught what to think, not how to think. We don't have a curriculum that's evolving. We have a curriculum that's static. If this is an evolving problem, then it should be in our evolving curriculum. But we have a static curriculum, so our curriculum needs to be more evolving, if that's what I mean. And I think if in school you were made to maybe not just do a geography lesson on like, I don't know, a few things on the environment, but not, instead of actually being like, look what's happening here, how would we contribute to that, and have them practically and funding something that they can do practically to support that, then, we're not going to really care, because we're being taught what to think, not how to. And I think there's something about education in regards to this topic that actually I think we'd benefit more if in schools we were allowed to, like, if it was, again, accessible. That was my point-ish.
Yeah, definitely. And also, just to bring it back to the poem you mentioned, I feel like, we could, we think about issues quite separately, and they're quite siloed. And we learn lessons like that as well. Going back to the curriculum, that's how our curriculum is set up as well. It's static, but it's also siloed. And, so when we talked about civil war in Syria and the migrant crisis and the refugee crisis, and like climate change is sometimes mentioned, but it's not anywhere nearly enough, I don't think, because that is also, that was a huge driver in what started that conflict, and what has, and what is continuing to force people to flee their homes, as you were talking as well about Cameroon. And I think that story is definitely missing. We do imagine climate change as this far off thing that's gonna, I don't know what, we sort of talk about ice caps melting and, homes falling off the cliff into the sea, and yes, but also the effects they are already with us, and they're affecting things in all sorts of complicated ways, but we can and should be talking about how those join up.
Yeah, it feels like when we talk about the climate crisis, people think global heating and sea level rise, but they don't think about any of the other things, the biodiversity loss and, the haze in Indonesia, the palm oil plantations. People don't think of all of those things as part of the same story of anthropogenic climate change, and it is the same story.
But I was even going to say, like, even the vocabulary you use there, that is not even accessible to me.
You're so right.
Do you know what I mean? Like, that is not accessible. You can say those. There's so many words I've heard tonight that I'm like, what is that? Like, what are those words? Because those words aren't even accessible. Yeah. To people I know who also were educated like myself. And like, obviously, in some ways, we can all go and self-educate. But then if you're not teaching us how to self-educate, then how do we know where to look and what to do? And I think people need to see, we need to see ourselves in general as people of the world. And that's when we'd actually start to care about the things that are going on outside of the bubble that is Great Britain, And I think that's part of the problem, that we kind of are so in our own space that we're not peering out, we're not stepping out of that space. But I think, just all that language you just I was like, what's that word? What's she saying? But I got what you were saying. But I was saying, like, those words don't...
They're alienating.
Yeah, they're alienating. And that's also part of the problem, because we need to be able to speak to each other in a way that makes me see you, that makes me see that you see me as a person too, and that I'm someone you can access. And and I can access you. There's that. I feel like certain vocabulary puts a distance, which then pushes us further apart. Yeah. And when we need to be gathered to fight this together, I guess.
Yeah. You're so right, Urielle. You're absolutely right. I'm going to open to the audience now because I don't think we've got very long left. We've got 10 minutes for questions. Let's say 15.
Thinking about things like TV, Netflix, YouTube, and so on, I don't see many kind of stories, fictional series or whatever, that have anything to do with climate change. What can writers do?
What can writers do? Well, yeah, I mean, we should be pitching and trying to get stuff on that's about this stuff and thinking about ways in which it is going to engage. Like that. There are a few things I sort of feel like, but I think the things that I've watched that have been, they're not necessarily solely about climate change. There's a lot I think about. There's a lot of dystopian stuff. There's a lot of stuff about fear of the future in general, because that I think climate change combined with political instability, combined with the rise of fascism, and there's this this sense of impending doom, I suppose, that's infected a lot of TV and film. But you occasionally have these films, like, I haven't seen it yet, but Dark Water, the film about the chemical company polluting. You occasionally have those kinds of lawyer takes on the big corporation and hopefully wins.
Like the Erin Brockovich.
Like Erin Brockovich, but it's we don't get enough of them. So I guess we should be pitching, right? We should be trying to create those stories and get them on. But like you say, it's difficult.
I was going to say a lot of I feel like the work that we do see on that is from a perspective of people who've already given up. Like, look, like, everything's shit. So look what's going to happen. Like, our government's messed up, and we now, some of us live on a spaceship because the earth is now inhabitable and we've messed it up. It feels like that's a lot of the work I've seen that's about the environment, in any way about the environment, because it's like, look, we've destroyed it. It's almost like, everyone's kind of lost hope. I feel like writers have lost hope, and so they're writing from like we've been defeated place. But then I think in some ways that's a good way to write from, because it's like, look, we're just going to install more fear so that you can see what it could look like. But also I think what we need to do is probably find the hope in maybe stopping it before it goes too far. Or like, not even if it's a thing that can be stopped, but at least slowed the hell down. Like, and how we can better support that. But because we live in such a capitalist world, only a certain kind of group of writers loom and dominate the industry, because they're able to access the large commissions at the massive production companies and the massive theatres. So you really only ever get a certain kind of voice, and if they're not
Jack Thorne.
Yeah,
Jack Thorne needs to write about the environment.
Exactly. But that's exactly the truth of the matter. I mean,
you were talking about simple language instead of anthropo whatever, and that's a big thing in XR is using plain language to talk about these things. But somehow we haven't developed a plain language for talking about the things that we want to talk about in this series of events. And I wanted to ask what you think of the word decolonise, because it's quite an unpopular word within the anchoring and kind of policy groups of XR, because they think it's alienating in the same way that anthro whatever is. And so I wanted to test that with you now, actually, because we need that to develop the language of these events.
It's only alienating because of what guilt people feel when they hear the word decolonise, and that's the truth. Like, anytime you talk about colonisation or anything or decolonising anything, I love creating just that awkward expression on certain people's faces, because I know how uncomfortable you feel. But honey boo, it's not all about you. And and I really I think actually good language for the kind of diversity and inclusivity that you need to push this further. Because, I mean, it's been about y'all, and we've been still screaming and crying about the same thing. So how about we try and make it more accessible to everyone? And I understand that that word has some connotations to it, but also we can re-empower it we can do it, like we can empower it in a different way and understand that it's not about feeling guilty or anything. It's about using that to do something productive, I guess. Yeah.
I think there's a feeling that there's a lot of judgment in that word, decolonise, that it's like on you to decolonise. But actually, there's no reason we can't all come together and do that. Do you have any final words on that before we...
Probably nothing profound to add, but broadly agree. I think I think we need to like not lose sight of what we're trying to do, which is to stop this horrible thing from killing us all. And there's, from my perspective, there's no reason why we can't talk about decolonisation like in that process. I also strongly think that we need everyone on board, and so that's like a part of the conversation.
But the problem is that people when they see the word decolonise, they see us and them, and there's no us and them in that. There is literally just the fact that we want to tear down a whole structure that is actually fucked up. Language again. That we're trying to tear down a whole structure that has messed all of us up. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not just it's not just for the brown people of the world do you know what I mean? It's for you too, because that's what I feel bothers me the most, because it's about all of us as a collective. You benefit from respecting that the culture needs improvement, and the improvement you'll benefit from, and we will benefit from it. There's no us and them. We're a collective people. I think people need to just learn to understand that word is not to segregate, but it's actually for us to call out the problem and stand in it together, no matter where you're from. Yeah.
I think that's a really lovely place to end. Thank you, Urielle, and thank you, Joe, and thank you to our audience.